Yeah, so hello everybody. Thank you for joining in, and happy Women's Day to everybody out there. Women's Day is celebrated every year to commemorate the achievements of women around the world. And today, on this special day, we at Aviyel would like to recognize Rachel for her amazing contributions spanning over 15 years within the Drupal community. Rachel has worked for over 4 years as the Community Liaison, helping Drupal Association better understand the needs of the Drupal community and the community better understand how the association supports them. Rachel continues today as a mentoring coordinator at Drupal, but has taken her open source skills to the GovStack project at the Digital Impact Alliance under the United Nations, and currently helps projects, open source governments, and include open source within their organizations as well now. She's had a wonderful journey within open source, and I couldn't be happier than today to host her over here. Thank you so much for joining in, Rachel.
Thank you for having me, Charu. It's been really nice to join in and just chat a little bit about the things that I've been doing and other people have been doing to try and make open source and the use of open source available to everyone, really, where everyone feels that they can be a part of that, and not let it just be used by, how should we say, a small part.
Right. That's interesting. Before we jump into the most exciting part of this event, I know that you've had a slightly non-traditional entry into the open source community, starting from managing your career. Starting your career managing Windows systems. Rachel, for the audience here, before we jump into the most exciting and part of this event, could you tell us a little bit more about how you got it started with open source?
With open source, I guess I'm gonna start really early in my career, because I think open source is all about people and working with people and either being part of bringing them together or helping bring them together. And literally, my first job was teaching fencing, with foils and épées and literally teaching that to school children. And I don't think open source is all that different, because you are giving people a huge amount of responsibility and helping them to work together to do something kind of really unusual and kind of really cool. So yeah, it was almost like in a way, my first start to open source was letting 7 or 8-year-olds and 9-year-olds play with swords, which is kind of weird. So I originally got involved with the Drupal project. I'd been using open source for a few years before, things like Linux and a few Java open source development tools, until I discovered Drupal by accident, completely by accident. I was working in the comms department of a pharmaceutical company in Cambridge, in the UK, and I was trying to explain to a web design agency exactly what I wanted a website to be. I had a really clear idea in my mind how I wanted this website to work, and I had a little bit of a technical background, more related to server management, but I'd taken this sabbatical into communications and PR, because I knew the team really well at this pharmaceutical company in Cambridge, and I was trying to explain so hard how to do what I wanted. In the end, I just searched around for some tools and kind of built something and said, I want this. I want you to build something that works this way, but make it look good, because I'm incapable of doing that. So they took me at my word, actually. They thought I meant literally build it in Drupal, because I just downloaded Drupal and started hacking away to make it work. So they literally built this website in Drupal, and I ended up using it and putting loads of content in. And I kind of got drawn in to, well, how am I going to, I learned all these things that I never really expected to. And I just got engaged with it. And then I got the opportunity to go to one of the big Drupal events. It was DrupalCon London, which wasn't in London, weirdly. It was in a city called Croydon, which is on the outskirts of London. Hey, that's another thing. And there I volunteered. I said I would volunteer some hours. And that was my first kind of contribution to the Drupal project. All I was doing really was standing on a flight of stairs, pointing people which way to go. That was it. But weirdly, it was like I didn't know anyone really. I didn't know what I was doing. I knew nothing more about Drupal than anybody there, probably much less. But because I was acting as a volunteer and directing people, everyone suddenly thought I knew stuff, yeah, and were asking me questions, and it really gave me an opportunity to engage with people. Suddenly, I was part of the conversation, just through that simple act of volunteering a few hours at the conference, to point people up a flight of stairs. Then I got involved in helping to actually create Drupal code as my knowledge grew. So I was helping people join, and then I started mentoring other people to do that. So yeah, and then I started mentoring others. We have a regular system in Drupal where we help other people to learn how to contribute code and documentation and so on. And then I got asked, well, you're doing this on a regular basis. Can you help organize our mentoring activities? And I started doing mentoring lead type work at Drupal events and going out there and kind of organizing those. And eventually I sort of became one of the mentoring coordinators, doing that on a long-term basis. In the meantime, I also got involved in helping with the code of conduct team, and helping to resolve conflict and code of conduct issues in the Drupal project. That was brilliant. I loved every minute of that. It was hard. It was working with people and having to ask hard questions and have those sort of challenging conversations, but it was really good. And it prepared me for thinking, well, maybe I should stop all this coding lark and go do community work full-time. So the Drupal Association at the time were looking for what was originally called a community manager role. And I said, no, I don't think we should call it community manager, because you can't manage people who are volunteering their time. I didn't like the term. So we agreed on community liaison as a term instead. So it sounds more like you're working with people than telling them what to do. So I preferred that. So I spent 4 years at the Drupal Association, helping them to connect more closely with the global Drupal community and facilitate bits and pieces of that, which has been great, helping run their code of conduct at events and working with people around the world, connecting with people went to Nigeria and stuff like that. We had a few camps in India. That's kind of fun. So yeah, it's been really interesting how that progression into different things has taken me to different places. Recently, I was just going to say, recently I thought, well, I've been doing all of these things in Drupal, and I want to continue doing the mentoring work in Drupal, the contribution mentoring work, but I want to get more experience of other open source projects because it's kind of the right thing to do, is to keep moving and finding new things. So I was approached about a project that was being started up by the Digital Impact Alliance, which is part of the United Nations Foundation. They're working with a whole bunch of other governments and organizations, the German government, the Estonian government, the ITU, and others, on a project called GovStack, which they're looking to make into an open source project. So they've got loads of experts who are creating a specification, for a better description, a document, and a set of working examples of how to build good government software. There's some really good principles by which they're doing it. So GovStack is a way of doing that. And as we're coming to the first release in the next few days, so if you look at govstack.global, you will see over the next few days that start to change as we start to make a release. We're looking to make that project into more of an open source project, so anyone will be able to contribute and participate and feedback on those specifications. But governments like Sierra Leone and I know Mauritania are interested, and others, that we can make it so that everyone can participate and work on those specs, and then help lower and middle income countries to implement them and have better government IT in those lower and middle income countries. So that's my next challenge.
That's very exciting, to hear about GovStack's new launch. And, I'm sure it enlarges the beauty of open source by, bringing it to more people and, especially in solving important social issues as well. So that's amazing. And, you've had quite a long journey from, I'm assuming, spanning over 15 years, starting from being a volunteer to, becoming a community liaison, now at DIAL. I'm not sure, is that how you call it? DAIL? DIAL? Okay.
Yeah, we did.
I was not sure if I just made up that acronym, so I just checking it. But, that's been such a peculiar journey. And I don't want to cut off your flow from that, but I want to take you all the way back to, before you decided to, become an official and active member of the Drupal community. How welcoming was it when you initially joined? And before you officially became a part of Drupal, did you see open source as a man's world?
I was lucky in that the open source project that I chose at random, as I said, I came into it accidentally, was already not perfect, but better than most, in that there were more than usual number of women and other underrepresented groups in the Drupal project and actively participating in the Drupal project than a lot of other open source projects. So did I think it was a man's world? Yes, there's definitely more men involved, definitely, in the Drupal project, and there still is, same as pretty much all open source projects. But it wasn't terrible then, the percentages were not terrible. There were other women about, and one of the things that really helped, and one of the really important things that other open source projects can learn from, is some of the leadership, the key leadership of the project. The people who are right at the top are women. So it means that when I come in, or when Justine comes in, or when Karen comes in, or where all the different other women that I know that actually started in the project at similar time to me, we can look and see someone at the very top and leadership of that project who is like us. I'm thinking of Angie Byron, she's on Twitter and on Drupal as WebChix. So people like Angie, who were very key leaders in the project at the time I started, is really important. So, I mean, if you want your project to be diverse, or call it what you want, inclusive, kind of the first thing, make sure your leadership represents not what your membership is so far, but what you want your membership to be. So if you want your open source project to be with lots of women, lots of other underrepresented groups, there's an easy answer to that. Start with your leadership and be, kind of ruthless about that. Make sure that they're there. Give them the opportunities to do that. Employ them.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more with that. As women, I feel like we always, look up to female role models, particularly more than anything else when we go deep dive into anything out there. So yeah, and especially I think even the fact that, you brought up the fact that, people like Angie Byron already being within the community really, shapes the way that you looked at the community as well. That, which I think was fair even when I started reading about Drupal. One of the key things that, I noticed was Angie being at the top of that, there were much more women than any other open source project out there. And, some on average, I'm guessing from the data that I've read, open source projects have around 3 to 4% participation from non-cis men, whereas Drupal has, it's almost around 20%, if I remember correctly, the last time I checked, which is, which is a stark contrast. So, coming to the most interesting question that I have for you, what do you think separates, what do you think Drupal is doing right that, other projects should be implementing to actually get those numbers way up higher and, bring in much more women and non-binary folks within the community?
It's more than one thing. So there's a whole bunch of things. I mean, I've mentioned one that's really fundamental, and that's having women and other underrepresented groups represented right at the top of your leadership. That is clearly really important. Another is creating the environment in which people do not feel unsafe. So things like, yes, having a code of conduct, but actually properly implementing code of conduct. So it's not enough just to have these words, but you actually have to follow the words up with substance. You need a proper system to handle code of conduct issues. You need to be seen to be handling them, and you need your leadership to be completely bought into that and be part of the system. You can't have your leadership of your project somehow exempt from the code of conduct. They actually have to do it. And if that means that a member of the leadership had to leave because of something that they've done, fine. That's more important than their participation. As simple as that. And I think those are really fundamental things that any project, any open source project could do today. Yeah, those things are really easy to do. If you don't know how to implement an actual process behind your open source project for code of conduct, speak to Say Sharp. Say Sharp is an absolute professional in this area, and they will take you through how to run the code of conduct and do it really well. So Say Sharp will sort that out, and they're just brilliant at it. And will help you understand that it's more than just words. It's definitely more than just words. But having said that, there is a really fundamental question that once you've got those things in place, what can you do in the longer term? How can you structure your project so that it makes it an easier place for women and other groups and other underrepresented people to participate? And there's a really there's a thing that exists wider than just open source. And it's like a fundamental truth that kind of shouldn't be a truth, but it is, and it's horrible. But women and other groups have less spare time to contribute to open source because those cis men that you mentioned seem to expect all of the women to do all the work at home, look after the kids and all that type of stuff. And whether you like it or not, and this does not apply to everyone. It does not apply to everyone. Of course, huge numbers of men are amazing and look after the kids and do all these things. It's great. But a lot don't. So on average, statistically, women don't have as much time. So you need to structure your project to somehow find the time for them. One of the things that Drupal did and did really well is when credit and contribution credit is given to people when they contribute, we don't just ask about who did it. We also ask, well, what's the context of the time that you spent? So we'll ask, did your employer give you the time to do this contribution? Right in our issue queues, right in, we don't use GitHub, we use GitLab and issue queues built actually in Drupal as it happens. So we can ask really custom questions of people. Did your employer give you time to work on this issue? And if they did, we give points, for want of a better description, to the individual and to their employer and to their employer's customer too, if they have an organization profile on Drupal.org. And then we make it so that points mean prizes for those employers. So we have a marketplace. If you go to Drupal.org/marketplace, what you'll find there is an ordered list of all of the companies that are selling Drupal services. And that list is ordered by their contributions to the project. So it's in an employer's interests to be at the top of that list. And the way to get to the top of the list is to give their employees time to contribute on work time. Well, the effect of that is it makes it easier for the women who contribute to spend time contributing on work time. Yeah, because it's good for the company, which means they're not expected to do it at home. And that means we got a higher number of women contributors because a higher number of people are contributing on work time in the Drupal project compared to a lot of others. So we make this massive help for inclusion by manipulating the companies that work with Drupal. Yeah, we manipulate how they participate and how they let people do contribution to the project at work, and that has a direct benefit upon the women and other underrepresented groups in the community. So it grows because it's the best place to do it. Yeah, you can work at home on one project, but when you come into work, someone's going to say, hey, you've got these many hours to work to contribute. Brilliant. Yeah, it works. Go do it.
I guess that really ties back into what I think the fact that there should be some sort of monetary incentive, if not behind a lot of these open source projects, because not everybody has the time to do it for free.
Yeah.
out there. And and it ties back into what Aviyel is trying to achieve with a lot of our projects, and make sure that those projects can sustain over the long time by building monetary incentives around it and distributing those incentives back into the community as well. um, not to take a detour, but folks, and for tuning in, if you have any questions for Rachel, you can drop them in the Q&A section on the platform. It's on the right hand side of the user face. You can drop your questions there, and we will be addressing them in the session towards the end or within the session as the time comes for it.
Yeah.
But one thing that and coming back, one thing that I found very interesting when you talked about your journey was you found building the code of conduct and implementing it very exciting. It's not something I've heard a lot of people talking about. I usually hear quite the reverse from a lot of people. But and like you pointed out, implementing the open source, I mean, the code of conduct within these open source projects is the real struggle. And and when implemented right, only then does the code of conduct really make sense. Particularly speaking to both you and Angie Barron, I know that Drupal has a more structured approach of approaching somebody who violates the code of conduct. A much gentler approach, however, it has been quite successful within the Drupal community. Would you like to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I can do. So we have a code of conduct team, which has, for the last few years, been led by one of the business owners in the Drupal community, George Demet, and he's literally just stepped down, and some of the other members have taken over now. And George helped set a lot of the processes that we follow, or we followed. I'm not part of it now, and yeah, it's literally just talking. So anyone can sort of send an email or send a message to a member of the code of conduct team, and all that happens then is we find out more about what's happening in what it is that somebody feels that they need to tell us about, and then it's literally contacting the original person and talking through with them. Quite often, one of the hardest things to get across is the difference between intention and impact. So quite often we'll have people say, well, I didn't mean to be taken, or I didn't mean for that to be offensive, I didn't mean for that to be hurtful, I didn't mean for that to make someone feel unsafe. And a lot of the times we have to spend a lot of time saying, yes, but the impact was this, and explaining the difference between what somebody intended and the impact it actually had in reality is quite often most of the work. To be honest, once you've explained that and they get it, usually the result and the resolution comes straight out of that understanding. We tried not to just ban people, and there might be a time where we have to say to people, hey, you need to stand back from the community for a while. You'll need to, if you're going to want to come back into the community, then we will agree a package of ways in which you can demonstrate how you've learned from being reported for the code of conduct and how you're going to change your behaviors in the future. So we always want to see a change from people, and then we might bring them back into the community in limited ways. So maybe online first, but not allowed to go to physical events. Not that I can remember what physical events were, in-person events. I've not been to one yet since we started coming back together. And then maybe, sort of like a stepped process back. And it can take months for someone to come slowly back into the community. Sometimes it works, and sometimes people just don't want to do that, just want to walk away. That's okay. Yeah, people are allowed to do that. Sometimes people don't like being asked not to behave in particular ways, but that's the standards by which the project works, and that's what we're going to stick to.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite things that that I've heard about Drupal, and it takes a more educative approach to dealing with people, and like you pointed out, like not having a better way to say it. Most people aren't assholes and they're just not. They don't want to make problems. They just, and that was probably their intent, but it just. And once they do realize, and a more educative approach is almost more better than just kicking them out and banishing them from the community altogether in one go. So that's one of the things I really appreciate about how Drupal works. I think we've started getting in a few questions already. But before we move to that, I just had a question. So a lot of the projects that we work with at Aviyel, we don't have a single female contributor as of now. So with what Drupal does is, I know promotes women to the spotlight through a lot of initiatives, and they raise them to leadership positions to build awareness about that. I mean, to tell the community that we value you. But if there are no women, where do we start from? Is my question.
Find some money, because you're not going to be able to bring a woman into a leadership position without being able to pay them. Honestly, yeah. I think that it's making sure that you give the space for women to participate on a regular basis. So if you get more and more women coming here on a regular basis to speak, like you've been doing all these speaking engagements recently, which is great. Okay, I'm speaking on International Women's Day, which is great, but I want to be able to speak when it's not about who I am, but what I do. Yeah. So it's making sure that people are feeling engaged on a regular basis, and then finding the roles that work within the project. And as I say, leadership roles within open source projects they take a lot of time. So if you're going to expect women to take part in them, you're going to need to pay them. I think it's honest truth. You might not like it, but it's truth.
Yep, that makes 100% sense. And for that, we need to build projects that have monetary incentives around them, which I hope is something that most projects are able to achieve in the future through Aviyel, not through Aviyel, through all means possible. And so that should bring more women into the workforce and into open source as well. And I think, that also stems back to the fact that, women in general, they're, it's been shown numerous times by research that we're just less we're more risk averse. Sorry. We're less risk takers, to be true. So, without having a stable, a stable income in front of us, it's highly unlikely that, we may step up to take it. And, that ties back into what you were talking about. Moving on. Sorry.
So, is it that women are less risk averse, or women find themselves in positions in society where the consequences of taking a risk are greater?
Yeah, I think that probably explains it much better than, I don't think it's something about our anatomy that makes us more of risk takers. Yeah, if a woman feels, she has 1 million fingers pointed at her, that probably men don't really need to experience in their lifetime. So which explains a lot of this, to be honest. But moving on, I know working within Drupal, you may have come across, you must have been a part of women in Drupal, formerly known as DrupalChix as well. Would you like to tell us a little bit more about that?
I think that largely, like any group of people within an open source project, women in Drupal is just a group of people who get together who have a similar background to share ideas, share understanding and ways of working within the environment we're in. If the environment is Drupal and contributing to Drupal, then a group of women doing that together is kind of cool and kind of nice. We get to help each other stand on the shoulders of giants, you know. So if we meet up as women in Drupal at, say, a Drupal event like DrupalCon, then it's great because people like Angie can meet people in that group and help them be known about. So you tend to kind of go, hey, these people are doing really great things, and make a big deal out about them. So Angie will highlight different people in the community and say, hey, you need to listen to Kathy or Rachel or whoever, Amy, June, you know, different people, and highlight them and give them the opportunities. So it's just a way of mixing and getting to know about those people who want to do more, but give them the opportunity. Yeah. And any, you know, women's group within any open source project kind of does a similar kind of thing.
Yeah, truly, you know, I feel like, you know, it's not just women, but in general, human beings thrive within communities, particularly, you know, especially, you know, navigating a tougher ecosystem like open source, you know, always having a group of people to back you up, no matter what is, you know. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I'll say that there is another group, there's the Drupal Diversity and Inclusion group, who have done some amazing work over the last few years to help bolster people from all sorts of backgrounds to help them stand tall within the project.
Yeah, so I've kind of, you know, ended with the questions that I had prepared for you for today. But, you know, now we have a few questions coming in from the audience. So I guess we can first deal with what Joshua has sent in. What are the major pillars to implement and drive a successful open source program in Drupal and Dial? Or if you can share more thoughts on how programs to engage the open source community can be structured, that would be great as well.
I'd say that being open always matters. So the small number of people who start a project need to remember that as they grow, they need to be actively listening to those coming in, because they're the most important people, certainly. So one of the things that I'll have to do at Dial, and particularly on the GovStack project, is facilitate and make it really easy for people to be able to suggest changes and so on, and to start to participate. And don't assume everybody is the same. So, for example, in the GovStack project, we're talking largely about documentation, but we're handling that documentation like code. It'll actually be in Git. And we'll be on GitHub shortly. So that's fine. And a lot of it is quite technical documentation, but some of it isn't. And one of the key personas, if you like, of the content are government officials in lower and middle income countries. So we've got, on one hand, we've got a bunch of developers looking at this material, and we've got government officials looking at this material. So we have to think, as an open source project, how can we treat them both as equal? And one of the things that we're doing in that project is finding ways by which they can all work on updating content, giving feedback, making changes, but do it in ways that make sense to them. So, for example, the developers in us, in me too, you'll be able to propose changes to the documentation and propose changes to the systems via pull requests in GitHub, because that's what we do, yeah? But also we've got people who that's horrifying to do, people who would not want to do that. So the main content will be editable via, we're going to use Gitbook, which has got a slightly nicer user interface. But in the background, all of that will be going into GitHub. And we've got ways for doing releases and so on. Then, some of these government officials, they don't want to know even about Gitbook. So you'll be able to participate in the project as a full member of the project purely through email. And emails will go into an issue queue, not on GitHub as it happens, it will go into Jira. And you'll be able to participate and ask questions and work with our maintainers purely through email. But do it in a way that is structured and so on. And eventually get the recognition for the work that you've done. We always want to be coming back down to giving due recognition for the contributions that people make. And any open source project should always be looking to do that. How can you recognize and reward the people who contribute, and recognize and reward them in a way that actually is meaningful to them? Not to you, not to the project, but to them. So for us, a lot of the developers want to see their green blobs in their GitHub thing, which is fair enough, and see that they've participated in lots of projects, and that's cool. Some government information minister probably couldn't care less. So we need to be able to give recognition and reward in ways that make sense to them, and involving them and highlighting them in different ways. So that's the type of stuff that we're doing. So thinking about that type of stuff, being able to say, here we'll work with all these different groups and have ways for them to contribute, but also think, well, how do you say thanks? How do you go, yeah, well done there, mate, that's great. How do you do that for each of the different people that you want to take part? And it needs to matter to them, not you. I would say that. If you share more thoughts on how programs to engage the open source community can be structured. I would say, that recognition and reward is everything. Everything that you do, be it blog posts, be it social media, be it GitHub green blobs, be it whatever you do, it's all about how you give that recognition and reward. That's it.
That's very interesting, and especially it's something where we've also started seeing a lot often non-code contributors, particularly, they're not given the recognition that they deserve, even though their contributions are just as valuable as code contributions. And in fact, if there was no proper documentation or outreach efforts, community efforts, all these things, a project wouldn't be able to actually scale to the level as it is, or it could. In fact, I would even go to the extent to say it can't even be adopted by anybody if not for a lot of those things that are in place right now. So yeah, that really ties back into that. We have another question from Rakesh. What change do you see in the open source world from the time you started and now? Oh, that's a very interesting question, especially, and I don't think a lot of people can, answer that. Only someone who's been in the community for so long as you have can actually answer that.
That is an interesting one, actually, because obviously I've been involved in Drupal for 15 years, and there's some things that have changed slowly over those 15 years, and there are some things that have changed very quickly in the last 2 years, and I'm sure you can think why. Looking slowly over the last 15 years, I would say the number of people who are participating in open source has grown. I would say that more and more people are beginning to recognize that looking in the long term for the sustainability of open source projects is really important. And I would implore everyone to find a group called Sustain OSS. I think sustainoss.org, although I'm going to be, Richard will shout at me if I've got that wrong, is an amazing initiative that Richard Lightower has been kind of leading, and others, it's not just him, looking at the sustainability of open source, and it's something I've been really interested in over the years. More and more people are looking at that and thinking, how do I make sure that my project and the people involved in the project are financially working? Does it work? How do we make sure that, for example, we have the right number of developers suitably recompensed for work in open source? How do we do that? Now, I've described one model for doing that in Drupal, where we actually have a marketplace and we give, we try to make sure the project is sustainable through getting people to be able to contribute during their work time. So that's essentially their work putting money into the project. Yeah, their employers putting money into the project by giving people hours to work on it. Other projects work in different ways. They're all good. I know the Closure project that I've kind of spent a little bit of time with has some really interesting things. They've got a thing called Closurists Together, which helps to get money together to give to developers to work on different parts of the Closure language, which is really cool. So there's different models for doing it, but you need to always be thinking, how do I sustain my project? And how do I just sustain projects overall? That really matters. In the last 2 years, there's that thing that happened, which meant that suddenly all of the events that we got so used to suddenly stopped in many parts of the world. I was in Lagos at an incredible event called Oscar Fest, OSCA Fest, with the Open Source Community Africa, which was incredible. It was an amazing event. And COVID was really starting to become a thing at that time. In fact, I think Nigeria had the first person arrive on a plane just as I was actually leaving. And that's the last event I went to. Kind of much of the world really shut down on open source events for a long time. And it's only really slowly starting to come back together again now. That had an effect on particularly large open source projects. So when we look at Drupal and you look at contribution, you have a situation where everybody, every developer has, or every contributor to a project has some sort of life cycle. Nobody is around forever, and that's okay. It's healthy. You always have turnover of people. That's fine. But what we did notice is the Drupal project and many other projects had built quite established systems. I mean, I was involved in some of them for helping to mentor and start new people being able to contribute to the project. And often that would take place with mentored contribution events at physical in-person events. And of course that wasn't happening suddenly over the last 2 years. And we had to really pivot and think, how on earth do you do that type of work on a regular basis to keep people learning how to do these types of things in virtual events? And it was hard. We spent a lot of time working on this. And I'll be honest, do I think we got it perfect? No, absolutely not. I think there's definitely things we could have done better. But we're learning over time to how to hold these virtual events where you're helping people become contributors to the project, whatever project it is. And I think it's actually something that Aviyel can look at and think about, and it would be kind of cool to see, is how do you create spaces by which you can say, hey, we've got these kind of like virtual tables, and people are working on these virtual tables and working on things together and so on. We have a thing in Drupal called the Global Contribution Weekend, which happens on a fairly regular basis, where people just kind of all over the world work at the same time, which is kind of fun. That's an interesting thing to do. So doing that virtually, it's not quite as effective as doing it in person, but it has to happen because the world has changed. And if the world has changed, open source has changed too. So yeah, we've had to learn how to do things that in theory should be easy, but actually they were quite hard.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Just adding on to the last part, I was just wondering, has the number of contributors actually coming in slowed down because of the pandemic, or has there not been a significant shift, or has there been an increase actually because a lot of people now have much more spare time because they're not actually working in office?
It's interesting because I can't speak for open source in total. I know the Drupal project, Dries Bayatart, the kind of project lead, wrote about this recently on his website, on his blog, about the number of contributors did go down a little bit over the COVID period. However, weirdly and interestingly, the number of organizations who were supporting them went up. So what we're finding is in the Drupal project, more people were being sponsored to contribute, for want of a better description, even if the total number went down a bit. And do you know what? That's probably a healthier place to be when we start to look at sustainability and all that type of stuff. It's become more normal in the Drupal project to pay your employees to contribute to the project. And that's a good thing. Has that come because of COVID? I think maybe COVID accelerated it a little bit. But I think it's a general direction we've been taking through the project to actually move more towards people doing it at their office desk rather than in their bedroom, which is kind of not really true, but that's what I mean. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess, we have 5 more minutes before I have to stop.
Yeah.
But I my favorite part of our chat that we had that day was the fact that you told me how open source has given you the opportunity to meet people from around the world, which
yeah,
I don't I know it was very interesting and very exciting for me to hear, especially about all your travels across. I know it's not directly linked to our topic, but if you could tell the audience here a little bit about how open source has allowed you to see so many different people and parts of the world,
Yeah.
that would be amazing.
My real obsession isn't open source. It's motorcycle travel, and so I love to travel around the world on my motorcycle and see a load of places. And open source is almost as an excuse to go. I once spent 100 days on the road going between different Drupal events, which was really good fun. That was mostly around Europe. I'm in open source. I've managed to go out to Nigeria. I've managed to go out to India to events in India, which was kind of cool. I get to meet people. Subi and a couple of Drupal people got married, both Drupal contributors, and they got married, which is really cool. In Rajasthan, in a city called Kota, there in India, and they were like, "Oh, do you want to come to the wedding?" And I was like, "Yeah, of course I do." So I just I jumped on a plane. I had a motorcycle in Delhi and rode down through Rajasthan to the wedding. So 3 days of wedding, and then kind of back via Agra and stuff like this. So yeah, I mean, I would never have been able to do that or felt confident to do that unless I knew people in India, and lots of people in India, which is just amazing. I've had, sort of offers of places to stay all around the world. Places like, I don't know, I wrote about the India trip to Subi's wedding on my blog, which is linked in my profile. And there's pictures there. But yeah, I mean, offers. I want to go ride the Karakoram Highway, which goes from Islamabad up to the Chinese border in Pakistan. And I mentioned this to someone, and they were like, "Oh, yeah, I live not far from Islamabad. You can stay at mine." And this is like this kind of cool thing, It's like, you get to know people all around the world and get to go do things. So, sort of like place to stay in Islamabad is like the most unlikely thing in most people's lives, but it's kind of normal in mine, and it's weird. I love it. I did actually. The Drupal community has got some really incredible people in it. People who see solutions in all things, and I recently saw something from people in Ukraine. Last year, the Drupal community in Ukraine we're going to have a Drupal camp there, an event there. Thanks, Cherry. And they were like, well, obviously we can't do it in June, but we fully intend to continue to have this event. And yes, people might think they're out of their mind, and well, they might not be wrong. But I love this message that they posted. And as soon as the situation is right there and they have this event, I will go. I will jump on my motorbike and ride across to Kyiv and have this, because this will be something else. But yeah, that's the type of people that are in open source.
That's amazing. Right before we close the event, I guess we've had one last question over here from Sobin. So it says, what do you think of Web3's role in the future of open source and building open source communities?
The honest truth is I don't know. The honest truth is I think that we should do Web 2 properly first. Once we're doing that, and we're doing that in a properly accessible way that works for everyone, then maybe Web 3 is a thing. I think that Web 3 sounds exciting. I don't know enough about it. I have not done the research, so any view that I might have is kind of not valid because I've not done research enough to say, but I know that there are many things we are doing in Web 2 that we're not doing well enough now, and how we include everyone. Yeah, so having decent accessibility and all those types of stuff. I would be concerned if we went to do a new technology whilst still failing to learn the lessons and fill the gaps that we're not doing now. That would be the thing I would say, is there are things that we're not doing today that are more important than implementing a new technology, that are more excluding. Those things we're not doing today are more excluding and important and vital and critical and urgent than some of the things that Web3 might bring us, which are promising and could be really cool. But if we fail again to do those things, then we've done it wrong.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's good.
That's very interesting, and just like you, all of us are very excited for what Web3 is going to bring to us, and especially for our product as well. We're bringing in a Web3 angle to it as well, so really excited for that. But I guess we're going overboard with time right now. I'm so sorry for keeping going. Hold it here, but with this, we come to the end of the session. Thank you so much, Rachel, for taking your time out to do this. I had a great time, and I hope you did as well, and everyone else who tuned in. Thank you so much for joining in today. With that, I guess let's close the event.
Well, thank you, Charu, and thank you for everyone for organising it, and thank you to everyone who came along.